Hi class, it's me again. I want to talk to you today about chapter 1, which is going to cover what is psychology. That is a really good question, and hopefully by now you know the answer. It's a study of mental processes and behavior, or you might have heard it as cognition or thoughts and behavior, and that's certainly something that we focus on in psychology. And but there's a little more to it than just the thoughts themselves and the behavior itself. So there are different approaches that you might be familiar with. We have the biological approach, cognitive approach, the critical thinking and empirical methods, the evolutionary approach. All of these things are terms that definitely and theories that play into how we study and understand psychology. Of course, we have some big players, if you will, like Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud contributed a lot to psychology, but as you may know, there were some things that we did not prove using the scientific method that we've kind of cast aside, if you will. But certainly psychotherapy, which is what Sigmund Freud is associated with, he contributed a lot there, which we still use to some degree today. But if you'd like, you can pull up your chapter PowerPoint slides over here and you could follow along. I'm going to just go over, I guess, a few of these slides. I'm not going to go over every single one of them, but just to kind of give you a brief overview. I've already pulled it up, but you can download it there, and I have it pulled up here. And so kind of like I was saying with Sigmund Freud, he believed that most humanistic behavior was caused by dark, unpleasant, unconscious impulses. So he really focused on, I guess, the negative side or the troubled side of human behavior. And some people didn't necessarily agree with everything that he had to say about that. And there was a spin-off from Freud, which was the humanistic approach or positive psychology as well. So back to Freud though, even the average person on the street is a mysterious well of unconscious desire. So Freud really focused on the unconscious or the subconscious, if you will, to try to understand why people did what they did or behaved in the way that they behave. And he had some a number of experiences with clients. As you can imagine, he spoke with a lot of troubled clients, and so he had a quote, "I have found little that is good about human beings on the whole. In my experience, most of them are trash." Well, some of us might have a differing opinion from Freud on that, but again, it kind of goes to show that whatever you surround yourself with can ultimately it can cloud your outlook, I guess, on life. So something I like to say to my students is be careful of your inner voice, the things that you tell yourself or the things that you seem to be consistently coming across. If you view the world in a negative light, if you think that that people have bad intentions, then that's exactly what you're going to find. But if you try to view the world in more of a positive light, if you look for the good, then you're also going to find that as well. So with Freud, even though he was a therapist and he probably offered a lot of good advice to people, sometimes even as psychologists we can lose sight that we can kind of need to take our own advice, and perhaps his perception was clouded by the people he was surrounding himself with. We talked a bit about positive psychology and the spin-off with humanistic psychology. There's in my lectures, I typically give you somewhat of a history. You can check that out as well. But someone else I would bring your attention to is Wilhelm Wundt. So Wilhelm Wundt is, I guess, the founding father, if you will, of psychology as a whole. He set up the first psych lab in Leipzig, Germany, and it's now considered the birthplace of experimental psychology. And he did this he basically took the philosophy and physiology components and created what we now know as psychology. Now, as far as American psychology goes, though, William James, he's going to be the person, what we would consider the founding father of American psychology. He also had another perspective, which was functionalism. Structuralism obviously is looking at the structures of the brain, which is what Wundt came up with. but James, he came up with functionalism, which is basically answering the question of why, or purposes and functions of, the structures and things like that. So be familiar with your theorists, Sigmund Freud, Wilhelm Wundt, William James, and there's a little bit more on functionalism. But we also have Darwin, Charles Darwin. Many of you have probably heard of Darwin from previous science classes you may have taken, but he came up with natural selection, which is an evolutionary process in which organisms that are better adapted to their environment will survive. But most importantly, they're going to produce more offspring. Okay, so survival of the fittest. You've probably heard of that term as well. And so this is across all species, so not just humans, but lions, tigers, and bears. No, I'm just kidding. Giraffes. I think your e-text gave you an example of giraffes. They obviously have a really long neck, so across evolutionary history, the necks got longer and longer because that was beneficial adaptation to them. You've probably also heard of mutations. Oftentimes that conjures up thoughts of bad things like tumors. I mean, obviously that is a mutation when a body starts developing a tumor, but not all mutations are inherently bad. Some mutations are beneficial, such as the giraffes and the longer necks. Over time they were able to survive and reproduce because they could reach the leaves way at the top of the trees. There was a lichen moth, I believe this e-text talked about it, that at one time was a pale color, almost white, but over time has now become grayish or a darker color because the environmental toxins like soot was building up on the trees, and the bark of the trees that they were attaching themselves to was no longer white. It was now like a grayish color. So the moths have now changed color. That's another example of a beneficial mutation or adaptation that has allowed that species to persist. There are 7 approaches to psychology. You definitely should be familiar with them. They're discussed in this chapter. We talked about biological approach, behaviorism, psychodynamic approach, obviously that emphasizes unconscious thought, the conflict between biological drives such as the drive for sex and society's demands and early childhood family experiences. Just generally be familiar with that. And anything psychodynamic or psychoanalysis is definitely going to have roots in Sigmund Freud. He's the one that came up with psychoanalysis. The humanistic approach, so I briefly mentioned that earlier, that was basically a spin-off from Freud. So, or I guess they kind of contradicted. They didn't agree with everything that Freud had to say. So the humanistic approach emphasizes a person's positive qualities, the capacity for positive growth, and the freedom to choose one's destiny. So essentially the humanists were like, hey Freud, we understand that, yeah, it's important to look at what's going wrong for a person, but what about what's going right for the individual? Humanists decided to pay attention to this and study it and understand what made a person successful or what made a person flourish. Humanistic psychologists stress that people have the ability to control their lives and are not simply controlled by the environment. So some things for you to really consider. Positive psychology is a spin-off of humanistic approach. Humanism, it started, they weren't using the empirical method or the scientific method, but I believe it was about the 90s, so it's relatively new. Positive psychology spun off of that, and basically it's almost identical except that now they're basing all their findings in the scientific method, so they're able to prove all of their theories. And of course the cognitive approach, we had mentioned that, evolutionary, sociocultural. Be familiar definitely with all the different approaches to psychology, but also careers. Be familiar with the different careers, because psychology, we typically think of a counselor and a client and a lot of conversation going on, and the counselor is trying to help the client figure some things out. But there are far more areas of psychology than just the clinical or counseling type of psychology. You have cross-cultural, sports psychology, forensic psychology, community, health psychology, sensation and perception, developmental psychology, and many of these areas of specialization, by the way, there are classes that are centered around them. So for example, human development or developmental psychology. That is a 16-week course that we offer here at Johnston Community College. That I guess after you take this class, if you'd like, you could take that one as well. So in Psych 150, again, we're just barely scratching the surface on many of these different areas. But when it comes to careers, just be generally familiar with what these different areas in psychology are covering. And demographics of psychologists. So I obviously, and I'm in academic, so I'm the bigger piece of the pie chart there, 34%. Many of us go into higher academia, but 12% will go into industrial, 24% will be in clinical, 22% will go into private practice, and then you have 4% who are like your school, high school, middle school, elementary school counselors. And so psychologists are everywhere. And we're in, and psychology happens in every single interaction and every single day. Anytime you're communicating with another person or interacting with another person, psychology is happening. So definitely, if you have any interest in psychology, you can feel free to shoot me an email. I can answer some questions for you, but also look into other aspects. Like, please don't base your entire opinion of psychology just off of 150, because I like to call this class a sampling platter. You're going to get just a little bit of a lot of things that psychology covers, but you're just getting a tiny little sliver of each. So there's also, I like to put some videos and things in my lectures, so if you'd like to check out the crash course videos, you can certainly do that as well. And just know that when you do go through these lectures, I have this at the end of every single one of them. Know that this does not cover every single thing or every component that'll be on your exam. I just want to put that as a disclaimer, because I do have questions from students when they ask about the lectures that I post, as well as the study guides. They are good guides or tools, if you will, but I would like for you to consider them just that. They're just tools. So thank you for your time, and clearly if you have any questions about Chapter 1 or any of my chapters that I'll be covering, please feel free to send me an email.